Hey everybody, I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSE Squared Podcast. Welcome, everybody, to the PBSE podcast. Steve and Mark here, coming at you with episode number 253, if you can believe it. Pretty wild.
254.
Oh, 254. Excuse me. I lied. I fibbed. 254. I guess I want to go back in time and relive the glory days, just time's flying by. We've got a good podcast today that we wanted to talk to you about or share with you. It's a little bit different than something we've done, at least for a while. It definitely is a shift in gears from recent podcast episode, which we always appreciate. This actually comes from an addict partner who sent this in to us. And what we're going to read to you is he sent us in quite a bit of detail. So we shortened down his submission and left out details that we thought were too revealing for him and his coupleship. But we wanted to read that and kind of talk about it as we jump into, as you can see, the title is a little bit compelling. Sex in our marriage has always been quote unquote broken. How do we repair and heal it? So that's the question to keep in mind as you listen to this. So here we go. I've been married for nearly 45 years to a wonderful woman, but she was severely sexually, physically, and emotionally abused as a child. She has repressed those memories in her later teen years. So when we met in college, she had no recollection of her past. So when they began the relationship, she didn't tie in with that abuse or didn't recognize that past at all. On our wedding night, when she saw my naked body for the first time, her personality changed. She still didn't remember her past abuse, but sex was scary for her, and neither of us understood the reasons why. She was okay with sex initially, but was never an active participant. And then he goes on to describe that most of the time when they would be sexual was very limited. She would engage very little. She was compliant or open to having sex, but it was much more about him and very little to do with her, and something she just kind of wanted done as quickly as possible. We were both frustrated, but had no idea what was going on. Complicating things for us was the very rigid religious background that we both came from and continue to be a part of. In an effort to improve our intimate relationship, I started looking for ways to make sex easier for her and eventually, unintentionally, got into pornography. Usually when I get frustrated or stressed out about something in our marriage or otherwise, I look at it for a few hours or less at a time. I can regularly go months without looking at it, then spend a few hours over 3 to 5 days, then go several months again. I'm now trying to get past this challenge, and my wife has been very supportive. So he's trying to be more in tune with his feelings, address things head on, not be avoidant, which we wholeheartedly endorse. We started counseling early on, but had some bad therapists who exacerbated our issues before we got a good counselor who helped us start remembering her past abuse and then dealing with it. We have worked together for many years to begin to heal, but sexually things went from bad to worse. And we infer from that, because again, we had to move some things around in the script, that in part that was due to his pornography use, the betrayal, the things that kind of accompanied that, among other things. We have worked together for many years to begin to heal, but sorry, I skipped that. As I have listened to your podcast, I realize I have been manipulative and angry and wasn't as helpful at home with the kids as I should have been. Basically, I've been a jerk and justified it because of the lack of sex in our marriage. I know that sex in marriage isn't a quote-unquote need, but I have really struggled with emotional intimacy without the physical closeness all these years. We are both committed to staying together. So how do we adapt to no sex and very little physical closeness little physical closeness, which I crave? I have used the analogy of us building our relationship like a house using bricks, representing the shared experiences in our lives. But sex would have been the mortar holding it together. Without that, our marriage seems very fragile and at risk of crumbling when some other tragedy or significant challenge comes along. So this is a lot, as you can tell. Even in this pared down version of this story, there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on, yeah. And I think, and as we start into this, of course, our hearts go out to this coupleship. We ourselves have experienced a lot of, dysfunction with regard to sexual intimacy. And The thing that Steve and I really want to point out as we jump into this, you both, if you've listened to our podcast for quite a while, we never try to dictate what the sexual part of your life or any other part of your life, your relationship, should look like or is supposed to look like. That's up to you. What we want to do in this podcast is really come from a place of how do you step into your empowerment as individuals and as a coupleship within this regard? How can he and his spouse really step into their power to not just do what their past dictates or the culture dictates or anything else, but they are the architects of this part of their relationship and they get to decide. And we want all of you to feel that you get to come forward now and design together what this looks like. So keep that very important empowerment. How do we step into our power, our sovereignty, into our collaboration as a coupleship when it comes to these things?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we will definitely be ending with that point. So we're kind of bookending
Yep.
the session, with you, Will, with those two points. But yeah, this really is a complicated situation, right? There are a lot of moving parts, and we ought to identify those before we really jump into this because it is a lot to take in. First and foremost, is we have obviously her past abuse and betrayal, right? This partner, from what, and obviously this is all an account based on the husband's account, but he has a partner who comes from a background that is very religiously, or not religiously, excuse me, very abusive, very unsafe, very complicated when it comes to sexual and other forms of trauma. What does complicate that even more is that some of that sexual trauma has been intertwined with some of the religious beliefs that both of them still engage with today.
Right.
Which we could do a whole series of podcasts, and maybe we will one day, on religious trauma and how it plays a role in this whole thing, because that is a very real, very poignant subject all its own. But needless to say, that does complicate her trauma itself. But then, in addition to that, I mean, we have these other elements, right? We've got trauma that she has experienced and endured within the relationship. Both of them come from this rigid background, which on a cultural level, has created some unique dynamics and challenges for them surrounding shame and other topics. Um, uh, Specifically, I mean, if we just dialed in on one, it's very common in religious backgrounds for people coming from those unintentionally. We're not attacking anyone's religion by any means, but it's very, because doctrinally that's usually not the case. But what we see is, on a cultural level, many people from religious backgrounds struggle with things like shame surrounding sex, right? In just a general sense, due to various factors. Oftentimes, also in rigidly religious backgrounds, more of the norm tends to be that discussions or dialogue around sexuality in general tend to be very closed off, if not just downright secretive. Um, I mean, that was very Mark and I can and speak to this often, right? We grew up in a culture, religious culture, that, even though doctrinally had nothing bad to say about sex or sexuality, culturally it was all about don't do it, 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 and so on, with a little teeny bit of, at some point you'll get to do it, but don't do it, right? And there were lots of other pieces to that, but that is definitely just one area that can make this difficult.
Well, and this couple is a little older.
Yeah.
They've been married 45 years, and so they've both experienced a great deal of change over that whole period of time with the sexual revolution and how things have changed in the culture and all that's gone on. We cannot begin to stress how absolutely critical it is to understand the various layers of complex trauma that she is dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he doesn't give details, but you get the sense that her sexual abuse when she was younger was so horrific that a part of her actually blanked it out.
Yeah.
Where she had no recollection. That is severe trauma and abuse when that happens, that dissociation. And then you can only imagine the various religious aspects, which he does mention, that we didn't put specifically, what religion that was, but he mentioned that was a part of her abuse as well. And they've continued in that, religious faith. And then he admits He's got into pornography. He says she's been supportive, so she knows about it. And he
Mhm.
says, I've been a jerk. I've been angry. I've been reactive, all because the sex in our marriage wasn't where I thought it would be. So he in some ways admits that he has been abusive. So the heaping on of this abuse on her side, the complex trauma is just layers and layers and layers deep for this woman.
Yeah.
Cannot begin to overstate what that means. Incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. And when you combine all of these factors together, right? I mean, what this amounts to, among other things, is that this has become an extremely sexually and definitely sexually, at least in some other respects, clearly emotionally unsafe environment.
Yes.
And if you're going to make progress in a dynamic like this, we're going to have a discussion about safety, what that looks like, how communication needs to change, and all those things. But before we get into any of that stuff, one thing that I wanted to mention for sure is that even though the situation definitely has some unique elements, it brings up a lot of common struggles for couples. Okay. This podcast is, if you've been listening to this point, it's far more applicable to you, more likely than not, than you've thought up to this point in listening. Because even though some of these things like abuse may be unique to this particular coupleship, a lot of the issues underlying and complicating this are not. And we're going to talk about all those today. And just to name a few of those, the first on that would be the changing physical dynamics of sexual expression or reciprocation in any relationship. Okay.
Yeah.
Sexual intimacy, just like any other area of a relationship, should be well, it isn't even a should, it is in a constant state of evolution. Relationships are constantly ebbing and flowing, and not just in a general sense, but in the way that in the way that we express, the way that we speak to one another, the way that we communicate with each other, the way we connect with each other. Right? Couples who are, for example, that's from just from a multiple places, but just look at the physical. The way a coupleship has sex in their 20s is not typical of the way a couple in their 80s does the same, just because of the physical barriers and limitations that are present, if nothing else.
Well, and
Right?
then not just pure age dynamic, but health issues,
Yes.
accidents, sickness, handicaps. So many things come up as a part of life that it doesn't rarely. Well, I was going to say rarely. Never does the sexual utopia that's painted for us by the culture, by pornography, by Hollywood, by social media, all the stuff that goes on. It just doesn't fit the real world of these relationships. So much is changing, so much impacts that physicality. And I don't think that we take that into consideration nearly enough from a standpoint of understanding, but also from a standpoint of self and relationship compassion and
Yes.
flexibility. Yeah.
Absolutely. You bring up a great point, Mark. I mean, the people within the relationship are changing all the time,
Yeah.
right?
Life stresses are hitting. Stuff's going on with your kids and right. I mean, we could name 100 things that affect how we then come together physically, all swirling and going on around us, all in flux and chaos.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, just the recovery process itself. I mean, Mark and I were two addicts in long-term recovery. We could sit here and talk about for the next several hours. We won't about the ways in which our views on sex have changed
Big time.
over the decades, right? I
Big.
mean, they're night and
Yeah.
day from what they used to be.
Yep.
And so the long and short of that is that this fluidity is something that people have to navigate regardless. These other significant issues, and we don't mean to minimize them at all, like abuse and this background that this couple is dealing with, they are significant. But to some degree, this journey that this couple is on is a journey that any coupleship that is really real about their relationship and is being authentic within it has to navigate regardless.
Yeah.
Um,
And having said that, with all of that present, what does that call for as a critical, desperate need in coupleships? The thing that we so rarely are engaging in at a deep, healthy level, which is the need for ongoing, vulnerable, transparent, authentic discussion in a coupleship about these issues, all the various elements related to intimacy. That, yes, is physical, but also, Steve, you and I talk about the 8 areas of intimacy.
mhm.
Intimacy in a coupleship is a very complex, deep, and varied thing too often we try to just boil it down to just sex. But that is one small piece of the puzzle. And are we having an ongoing, open, collaborative dialogue where we're bringing stuff out into the open that we would normally keep buried deep down? Religious, unhealthy religious cultures, unhealthy family upbringing, all of that tends to shut down this open, vulnerable, ongoing discussion. It's critical, and yet we so rarely do it.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. And before we jump into that part too much, this being honest with everyone, this is not in our notes or in our sheet notes for today, but we do want to acknowledge and recognize that even though we are dialing in on focusing on the sexual dynamic in this relationship today, it does not mean that the obvious things that we talk about on this podcast all the time should also be happening in tandem with that today. So, for example, accountability and ownership and making amends on his side
Yes.
for the elements of betrayal that he has portrayed, prolonged, caused, exacerbated in this relationship, right? The healing, the accountability, the transparency, all the other things that we always talk about in here are still in force. So please don't mistake our focus on this for the next few minutes as we're blowing that off. So
Yeah.
just want to.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on his side for reconciliation and creating an environment of healing for her.
For sure.
Without question. We talk about that in a lot of podcasts. Hey, everybody, PBSE podcast hosts Mark and Steve here with a special message about our revolutionary online recovery program for addict spouses and couples called Dare to Connect. Multiple times every week, we get messages from subscribers in the program. They're people just like you. They're trying to heal from the devastation of sex and porn addiction and betrayal trauma. And here's a few of our most recent submissions. Here's one from an addict in recovery. It says, D2C has principles that everyone should utilize regardless of their circumstances. It doesn't matter your coping mechanisms. It matters that you want to work towards genuine connection with your partner.
That's awesome. Another testimony from an addict continues on. My wife is just starting out in training as a licensed therapist. Dare to Connect has been far more useful to her than her degree.
Wow.
The way Mark and Steve apply what they've learned is always so redemptive. D2C has opened doors for my relationship that I thought would be shut forever. Mark and Steve are an incredible resource of information on the subject of sex addiction and betrayal trauma. We could not do this journey without their help.
Here's one from a partner who's been with us for nearly a year. I want you both to know that it is because of you guys and D2C that I'm able to be in the place that I am today. I will always be grateful to you both for your feedback and prompt replies to my questions. I can't even come close to putting it into words how valuable my time spent with y'all this past year has been to my life. Thank you for everything you taught me about betrayal trauma and boundaries and thinking errors and loving myself and making myself a priority and standing up for myself.
Love that submission. And then as we close out here today, guys, one more account from another addict in recovery. I wish I had a platform like this 14 years ago where I could have learned and done the hard work of recovery before I had done all this damage to myself and to my spouse. And to be candid with all of you, that's exactly why we created Dare to Connect. Mark and I found ourselves in that place. Messages like these and the others like them, they're what Dare to Connect really is all about, guys, and why Mark and I do what we do. Whether you're an addict or a partner of an addict, and no matter where you find yourself in the recovery process, Dare to Connect can take you to the next level. Don't wait another day to catapult your recovery forward. Today is your day for change. Visit us at daretoconnectnow.com to pick up your free 2-week trial of Dare to Connect today.
One of the things that hit me, Steve, and you and I talked about this before we started today. As I read this guy's expressions, what really hit me was we all need to measure our willingness, our openness to step back and realize that we each have existing sexual paradigms, attitudes, backgrounds, knowledge, understandings, experience that we bring to our relationships. And if we can't step back to really look at that, if we think that our way is the way, right? What is sexually needed and healthy is what I declare it to be. You kind
Hmm.
of hear a little bit of that inflexibility from his part. But what does sex mean? What do the different sexual acts mean to me or to you? And how heavy an influence does the entire background from my time as a tiny kid when I started to be exposed to all of this until now? How critical is it to understand all of that? What do I bring to this relationship sexual table? There is a lot. And how does what I bring impact what we're experiencing today? Am I willing to step back and openly assess where these paradigms come from? Am I willing to call them into question, to challenge them, to be flexible, to, right? I know as I look at how where I came out in the sexual part of my relationship, I had some very narrowed viewpoints. I call it today. Looking at sexual intimacy in my relationship like I was looking through the little tiny hole of a drinking straw. Here's Mark's view of how this all works in his relationship. And I brought a lot of baggage to what caused all of that. And I've had to really decide if I was willing to question all the stuff that I thought I knew about sex, all the attitudes and needs and demands and everything else that I brought to the relationship. Was I willing to step back and really put that all on the table, shine the big bright spotlight on it, and really see, okay, what's true, what's not, what's healthy, what's not? Is there room for me to change, to adjust? All of that. So huge with coupleships.
Yeah.
It's not simple. Well, yeah, we want to have sex. Simple. No, no, very, very complicated. Yeah.
Well, and as you're indicating, Mark, it is a complicated dance, and not always do we need to be looking at it this viscerally, but this is an important dialogue for couples to be having on a regular basis, right? When, for example, I mean, if we just threw an example out there, when you hold my hand, what does that mean to you?
That's a great question. I
What does that
love that
mean?
question. Yeah.
Right? Because that means a lot of things, or can mean a lot of things. And the of course obvious question next to it would be, what does that mean to the what does it mean to the person whose hand you're holding?
Hmm. Well, and it sounds like
Right?
some people might think that's a crazy, ridiculous, simple holding a hand. What are you talking about, Steve? But I will tell you, holding my wife's hand today is radically different in its meaning from what it was even 10 or 20 years ago. Holding my wife's hand is a highly intimate experience for us. And I don't want to get into all the reasons that is, but when I hold her hand, the meaning behind the feeling of that hand, and when I look over at her holding her hand, it's almost like a whole lifetime of experience together is encapsulated in the holding of that hand. This, I mean, it means a lot to me. And it can be in and of itself today a completely fulfilling and awesome intimate experience that can stand alone if it never goes further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great point, right? And I mean, when was the last time we asked ourselves simple questions like this? Like Mark said really well, I mean, and God knows our culture is wired to think this way, right? Our culture is constantly in a subconscious fashion reinforcing and teaching all of us, quote unquote, about the norms of sex
Oh
or
boy,
the
is it
norms of
ever.
physicality.
It is.
And boy, is it a crappy teacher.
Yeah,
Right. It teach and it doesn't just teach meaning, it teaches expectation.
it does.
Right? It teaches, well, after this many dates is when you should have sex, or this is what sex should look like this far into a relationship, or whatever the case may
Yeah,
be.
or if this didn't take place, then it wasn't complete or it wasn't fulfilling, or or. Yeah.
And that is all just cultural paradigm that has been put together by loud voices in a popular forum.
And
Right?
we've heard it tens of thousands of times reinforcing that quite
Oh yeah.
frankly, I got to the place where I didn't know what was sexually authentic for me and not.
Totally.
What voices were speaking it? My heart, my true higher deep down self, or the indoctrination and brainwashing I'd received for, my whole lifetime. It's hard to discern.
I remember when I was like 5 or 6. It's one of my earlier childhood memories. We didn't have a lot of movies growing up. This was like back in the day of VHS tapes and whatever else. But one movie that we owned was the Disney movie Bambi.
Mm.
And I still remember, and I can almost quote it to you like in vivid detail, the whole section in that movie where the owl, whose name I have forgotten, um, talks about being Twitter painted
Yeah, Twitter painted. Yeah, yeah,
and what that looks like. And then there's the scene where
yeah.
Thumper falls in love with the gold bunny, who I don't think has a name. And then there's Flower the skunk, and he falls in love, and right. And you think about like these little innocent little messages, and I'm not knocking on Bambi at all, but this began then,
Yeah,
right? This
yeah.
this quote unquote teaching has been happening for forever.
And whenever Thumper's around, the girl bunny, his back leg starts thumping, uncontrollably.
Right? And it's cute and it's adorable, but like what Mark just said, does that not teach some both healthy and possibly some unhealthy things?
Yeah.
It does, right? I mean, we were not going to break down Bambi or analyze that
But
today. The point we're just trying to make is that we want to, in part of this discussion today, we want to be opening up your mind to where the hell have all these ideas about sexual norms for me and my partner? Where have these even come from?
seriously, and
What are they?
have you accepted them as just, I used to think, well, this is just how it is.
Exactly.
This is what it has to be. And if we don't have this position or this thing that happened, then I'm going to walk away moody and grumpy and dissatisfied.
Yes.
And where does that come from? Right? As our point is, as a coupleship, no one gets to tell you how this is supposed to go
Unless you want them to.
unless you want them to, unless you want to allow them to.
Yep.
And one of the unfortunate things that Steve and I will tell you, because of our decades of pornography addiction, we brought all that into the marriage with us. Expectations, paradigms, how we would approach that sexual intimacy. It was, quite frankly, incredibly tainted and had a lot of toxic aspects because of all that was brought with us. I just assumed that was just the way it was until I started to question it, stand up to it, challenge it, break it apart, step back and own my toxic, unhealthy aspects of it. And then when my partner and I we started to open up the dialogue between us for the first time and get really authentic, there was a real, first of all, it was awkward for me, even embarrassing. I was like a person stumbling over myself because I didn't know how to talk about it. But as we started to really open up that and really find out what it was in a full, healthy, holistic sense for us, we really started to realize that we were empowered in our sexual relationship. We were the architects, and we got to sit down and decide, what is this? What does it look like? What are the wants and needs you have? What are the wants and needs I have? Are those wants and needs healthy? Are some of those even questionable? And how do we get to now collaborate together to design this beautiful, wonderful sexual relationship going forward exactly the way we want it? It was kind of shocking to realize that we had all that power and all that say so. Right? I didn't know that was
Absolutely.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We get to decide, right? I mean, the way that we would phrase it to all of you today is every coupleship here and each individual within that coupleship has the right, but also the obligation, right, to decide how do we want this to look. Every coupleship, I when I meet with a couple, I know Mark has similar thinking. When I meet with a couple, one of the things that sometimes crosses my mind visually is I picture like a book in front of me as a therapist. And this book has however many chapters that are already written, right? And those chapters are written. They're written. They've happened the way they've happened. The story's gone the way it's gone. Those pages aren't changing. There is no going back and editing. But those chapters do not in any way determine the blank pages still left in the book.
Right.
And all of us have the right and the obligation to be looking at this book and saying, okay, if we open up the chapters on sex in this book, okay, they've said this to this point, and we need to acknowledge, accept, and really connect with that. But in the same token, that also empowers us in the same light to be able to say we get to write the next 6 chapters on sex, however the hell we want to write it. What
Exactly.
do we want it to be?
What do you want it to be?
It
I,
doesn't have to look anything like it always has. Just because our marriage, and I'm speaking to this couple directly now, because I know there are other couples listening to this podcast. Hell, I'm thinking of one or two of my clients who probably need to hear this message too. Just because you've been married for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades like this coupleship does not mean that you either can't or are excused from deciding how you want this to look today for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I had an acquaintance years ago. It was one of the most radical examples that I've ever seen. And I don't say this to say that this only applies in extreme situations like this, because it's not the case, but I think it illustrates really well how our paradigms, we can decide to change them radically. It was an acquaintance I had, and his wife had a stroke. She was paralyzed from the chest down. Now, some people say that would literally destroy the whole sexual relationship. It's over. We're over. We're done. And there have been those who have left their spouses and partners because of severe health issues. They've left them because it's like, I
Yeah.
can't do this. He he decided, they decided together that he was going to change his whole approach and paradigm with regard to this and all aspects of their relationship. Long story short, he spent 10 years taking care of her. And he said this to me. He said, Mark, it was the most intimate, close, precious, connected, collaborative, amazing 10 years of our marriage, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. He said, I learned things about love that I never knew ever. And when she finally passed away, it was one of the greatest gifts I had ever been given.
Wow.
Now, how do you take that and compare it against the typical sexualized culture's paradigm?
Boy, does that fly in the face of what many of us have bought into.
Wow. Yeah. And we're all at different degrees in between that and where we are today, of the different variables and situations and alterations and things that have happened and all the stuff that we experience that is impacting our physicality, how we demonstrate these physical affection and all these various things. It's all impacted at various degrees, including and on up to where this guy found himself. What are we going to do with that? How much of our power are we going to step into? How much are we going to say, this is up to us, damn it? And this world doesn't get to dictate this anymore. Neither does my past get to dictate this anymore. We're deciding what this is today going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully, guys, this discussion is opening up your head and your mind and your heart to something that maybe you've never even thought of, or at least to thinking about this in ways that you've never thought of. Now, there and with empowerment also comes responsibility, because I am speaking to those couples who may find themselves in a place where perhaps in your coupleship in some way, shape, or form you have used the excuse, well, we've been this way, or I've been this way for X amount of years. So this is just how it's going to be. We would lovingly tell you first, we understand the hesitations and the fears behind making change, whether it's at any stage of life. And there are lots of unique challenges behind that. Looking at these things can be scary, it can be difficult, it can be lots of different things. But that being said, you to make a statement like, I have been this way for this long and I'm never going to be different, in our not so humble opinion, would be simply playing victim to circumstance. Each of us has the capacity to change our station from wherever we are at today to something different. Doesn't mean it happens overnight, nor does it mean that change is instantaneous. But we can decide as an individual and as a coupleship to steer this ship differently today, right now, in a way that is different. Too many coupleships suffer unnecessarily because they've bought into the notion that because X amount of chapters have been written this way and we only have this many chapters left, we can't make change. And we would tell you that is a fallacy. Relationships can always be healed or changed or grown or worked on. It's just a question of if you want to. Is it worth it to you? Is it authentic for you to do so? Are each of you in a place where you're willing to make that change or to look at these things? So hopefully today's discussion, like we said, is a different podcast, but hopefully it's different in a good way, to be able to look at and assess some of these things in a way that maybe you haven't looked at or assessed them before,
Yeah.
in terms of opening up the door to some new possibilities.
And we kind of finish up where we started. We
Yes.
invite each of you to step into your power, and your sovereignty and your right to have this be what you want it to be. And it starts individually. All of you guys suffering with addiction and sexual dysfunctions of all shapes and sizes. You have a lot of work to do. You betrayed partners who are legitimately suffering in all that you do. You have your own paths of healing. But as you take on those sovereign paths and step into your own power, you now are able to decide if you're going to come together to collaborate in your power as a couple. And we invite you to do so. And if you want to really step into that power big time, come on over and join us in our Dare to Connect program, because we have a whole culture of empowerment for addicts in recovery and partners in healing and coupleships in repair. So come on over and step into that culture of empowerment with us. Come and try a free 2-week trial, try it out, see what you think, and go check that out at daretoconnectnow.com.
Absolutely. Guys, thanks for being with us and allowing us into your hearts and homes. We appreciate all of you, and we hope to catch you in the next episode. You can always send us questions to the podcast at, if you go to daretoconnectnow.com and click at the PBSE podcast link up at the top, there's a contact form down at the bottom of that page where you can send those questions into us.
Yeah. All right, everybody, take care. We'll catch you in our next episode.
All right, bye-bye.
Everything expressed on the PBSE podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.